Hello, various humans around the world. I am a stranger, and today we're going to talk about the history and lore of BattleTech, Part 1. Our story begins with mankind's history being basically the same until the turning point of 1988, where Mikhail Gorbachev decided to get a head start and dissolve the Soviet Union early to try and relieve Russia's economic decline. This would create the Russian Federation, which would immediately go into an economic decline. However, this at least came with increased political tensions, both externally and internally, with former Warsaw countries. Realizing they only made things worse, the Federation would hit the rewind button and recreate the USSR in 1997, after a political coup. The newly reinstalled USSR would then immediately go into an economic decline in an attempt to rearm itself. However, this at least came with even more political tensions, as relations with NATO quickly crumbled. Now realizing that apparently not too much, and not too little Marxism, was a bad thing, in 2005, the USSR tried a new strategy of slowly reforming the Union, and even reached out to Western assistance to help restart their economy. This strategy was different from the previous ones, as it actually worked, so naturally many hated it, and it was ended in 2011. When many Russians decided to simply murder each other in a civil war, mostly by rebels and other hardliner groups, wanting to return to the golden age of starvation and possible nuclear conflict. NATO, likely fed up with the redundancy, took the opportunity to intervene and invaded Russia, which ended the war in 2014 and permanently dissolved the USSR and all of its equivalents. Now free of the immediate threat of nuclear war, the Prime Minister of Britain met with the leaders of NATO and the other European powers to discuss how to avoid the future threat of nuclear war. The result was to merge NATO and the other major European powers into a global alliance, figuring if everyone liked each other, they wouldn't try to bomb each other. This would result in the creation of the Western Alliance. The alliance soon grew, with many nations joining, some even by consent, until practically every nation was under its banner, and the alliance renamed itself to the Terran Alliance in 2086. Under its reign, many nations prospered, and the ones that didn't matter to the ones that did. As well as third world exploitation, the alliance also has a strong focus on scientific development, particularly space travel, possibly to solve any future overpopulation problems. This led to the creation of the Demos project in 2103. The Demos project was an attempt to create the first jump ship, a ship capable of faster than light travel, through the use of quantum physics science fiction, loosely based on some real-world theories. They would succeed and create a prototype jump ship that would make its first jump through space on September 3rd, 2107. The first human jump would be performed by Raymond Batch a year later, in February of 2108. After that, the space craze was on, with every nation having ambitions to colonize the stars. Because why not? It was there, it was free land, and if there were other beings there, we just had to move them. This would lead to the first period of mass colonization, known as the First Terran Exodus, from around 2123 to 2242. The effort was massive, with at least 108 known colonies created in 2186 alone. All alien-free, because the creators wanted this to be more of a man v man kind of universe. However, as these things go, new land brought new reasons to hate each other, and it wasn't long before many of the new colonies got fed up with Terran Alliance control. This was done for no reason, according to the Alliance, but the colonies claimed to be fed up with the corruption and vast exploitation of their resources. This led them to make plans to try their own shot at independence. As it turns out, this anti-alliance sentiment wasn't just found in the colonies, it was also popular back on Earth. As the Alliance kept hoarding resources for the space program, many nations suffered in poverty, especially what few nations remain on Earth that weren't under Terran Alliance control. These separatist elements reacted to the Alliance's corruption in one of two ways. One was to flee Earth and start their own illegal colonies. The other was terrorism. And so, they did both, which resulted in over 100 unofficial colonies being created during the first Exodus. Meanwhile, a series of bombings, assassinations, and possible acquisitions of nukes began on Earth, starting from the late 22nd century until it ramped up to full-on war for control of Earth. The Alliance would win, after a series of incredibly violent conflicts, resulting in the Alliance having complete control of Earth in the early 23rd century. A bit depressed by this news of peace, and wanting to keep the anti-alliance trend going, a bunch of the colonies took this moment to start their own rebellion and break off from the alliance. This would lead to the first major interstellar conflict known as the Outer Reaches Rebellion, starting in 2236 on the appropriately named planet called Freedom, marking the first time humanity would murder each other on an interstellar scale, the true next step for man. This time the war didn't go so well for the Alliance, as many of the rebels, having learned their lesson from the conflicts on Earth, had dug in for Alliance retaliation. This foresight paid off, as the first couple of conflicts resulted in massive Alliance defeats. As the war dragged on, and the Alliance kept losing, more worlds bravely demanded their independence, now that they believed they were free of any repercussions from doing so. This growing spread of independence across the colonies would result in major political infighting in the Alliance on how to deal with this new issue. This would ultimately result in the expansionist faction that largely controlled the Alliance up until this point, being ousted from power by the isolationist Liberal Party. The likely source of the Liberals' rise to power was that they had come up with a surefire way to end the growing quagmire of the rebellion, which was to give up. In 2237, the Alliance ended all ongoing hostilities and pulled their forces back to Terra, ending the war, and, in 2242, implemented a demarcation declaration, granting all colonies outside of a 30-year light radius from Terra independence, whether they wanted to or not. So, if the colony wanted independence, congratulations. If not, you. While many cheered both on and off Earth as the first major blow to the Alliance, and the dawn of a new age, as it turns out, the Alliance would have dire consequences for both the Alliance and rebels alike. You see, many colonies actually hadn't planned on leaving the Alliance, and most of the ones that did weren't really prepared either, as they hadn't really thought they'd get that far. This was a massive problem, as a lot of the colonies lacked certain resources and had relied on the Alliance to provide them, like food and water. Now left to their own devices and cut off from Alliance support, most of the colonies decided the reasonable thing to do was to devolve into a frenzied panic. Indeed, not long after the declaration, massive conflicts opened up between the colonies as they fought for whatever resources they could get their hands on. The situation got so bad that soon many colonists decided to abandon their worlds and flee further out into space. The goal was to find more habitable, resource-rich worlds and to escape the growing bloodbath. This flight of refugees would accidentally create the second period of mass colonization, known as the Second Terran Exodus, officially beginning right after the first, in 2242, and lasting until 2398. This period would permanently reshape the galactic map in two key ways. One, as talked about, would be the immigration of colonists and the creation of more colonies further out into space. The second would be the formation of the first major and long-lasting interstellar nations, as the war forced conflicting colonies to reforge alliances and expand their own power in an attempt to survive. This would lead to the creation of three main sectors, which, from then on, would more or less determine how human-controlled space was organized. First, you would have the outermost sphere, the periphery, made up of pretty much any nations that were more than 450 to 550 light years away from Terra. Anything outside the periphery, known as the deep periphery, being either uncontrolled or completely unexplored space. This section would be composed of the younger, smaller nations and colonies, usually formed during the Second Exodus. For pretty much their entire existence, they would generally be regarded as a space version of the Wild West, or the galactic backwater to the rest of human-controlled space. The only ones who wouldn't hold this view would be the people in the periphery itself, who saw themselves as the only people free from the extensive war and political turmoil of the other sectors, even though war and political turmoil would plague many of their states for centuries to come. After the periphery, you would have the Inner Sphere, composed of generally of anything less than 500 light years away from Terra. This would house the largest and most powerful interstellar nations that were mostly formed out of the original colonies. This would include the 5 most powerful nations after the Alliance, though those 5 wouldn't pop up just yet, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, back to the galactic map. The Inner Sphere would be the largest, and one could say most prosperous, part of human space. However, as a consequence, it would be the stage for the most of the conflicts and plot-relevant events in BattleTech history, which would make the nations of the Inner Sphere the only ones that matter when it comes to interstellar politics. To them at least. Then finally you have the tiny part of space around Terra controlled by the Alliance. Though this part of space would still be part of the Inner Sphere, it had always be seen as slightly different for having a closer relationship to Terra, with the planet itself remaining the focal point for human-controlled space. At the end of the Second Exodus, this was how man-controlled space would be divided for basically the entirety of its existence. So, while the Periphery was being founded and the Inner Sphere was getting their affairs in order, what was the Alliance doing, you may ask? In a word, disintegrating. Deciding that they were pretty terrible at running an interstellar empire, the Alliance pulled back their forces to try and rebuild Terra. As it turns out, they were pretty terrible at that too. This was largely due to the leaders of the Alliance being guided more on corruption, short-sighted thinking, political infighting, and ideological zealotry than any desire, or logical reasoning, to address the actual problems that plagued Terra, such as mass starvation. As the people's discontent grew, and the Alliance parliament stagnated, it became clear that Terra was slowly approaching a tipping point. Eventually, all it would take was one person who had the power and the will to tear the Alliance down and build a new order in its place. As it turns out, that person was a middle-aged man with humble beginnings and grand ambitions. No, not that one. Not that one either. That's the one. That man was James McKenna. Recruited into the army at an early age, McKenna was found to have both strategic and leadership abilities. He quickly rose through the ranks, despite his independent streak, until he was made Fleet Admiral of the Alliance. This is when James started to make his mark on history, because as the new leader of the Alliance Navy, he finally had the power to implement the construction of the Alliance Navy. You see, up until this point, while there were space vessels designed for the housing and transportation of troops, there were no dedicated warships with any sort of hull-mounted weaponry. This was due to two factors. The first was that jumping through space requires a lot of power, so much so that the ship's engine, or jump drive, takes about 95% of the ship, leaving only 5% for other things like the crew, their life support, their supplies, anything else needed to keep them alive, and hopefully some space for whatever they had to transport. This didn't leave much room for weapons. The second, there just didn't seem like a real reason to develop them. As far as the Alliance was concerned, any interstellar conflict had been small scale and land-based, only fighting for control of this or that colony world, and even that was largely in the past. In fact, during James's time, due to the policies of the Liberal Party, it was almost borderline illegal to even talk about the colonies, to the point where some pretended they didn't even exist. So it was easy to understand why designing warships seemed ridiculous. McKenna, on the other hand, likely saw what was happening in the rest of human space, or just made an educated guess, and figured some of the space people may have harbored a grudge at the Alliance for leaving them to die. Or the colonists would just decide their best chance of survival was to invade the one planet they knew was capable of sustaining human life. As such, James pushed heavily to start the warship program. He would eventually succeed and create the first warship, the TAS Dreadnought, in the year 2300. The creation of the warship was achieved through the revolutionary idea of taking the standard jump drive and making it smaller. This led to the creation of the compact Kearney Fuchida drive, which finally allowed enough room on a ship to house weapons. The downside, and the reason why this didn't replace the regular drive outright, was that the compact drive was expensive. Very expensive. So much so that James quickly came under fire for the cost of building this new war fleet, and was accused of mismanaging, mishandling, and misusing government funds. A true rarity in the Alliance, to be sure. Still, McKenna continued with his project, going on interviews and talk shows to speak in support of the program, to sway public opinion to his side. He would also continue to expand his power base, both militarily and politically. His work would bear fruit with the creation of 6 other dreadnoughts and a score of smaller vessels by 2314, marking the completion of the first official human-made war fleet. And not a moment too soon, as on September 5th, 2314, Earth had finally reached its boiling point, and civil war descended on Terra. The war was triggered by the Liberal and Expansionist parties after the assassination of the People's Independence Party's political leader, Grant Zolli, caused the two parties to finally engage in open war. Realizing that the conflict could soon spread to the rest of the Alliance-controlled space, and fearing that the war could escalate to unimaginable proportions should the military pick sides, James took his fleet and retreated to Mars. He then rallied all forces loyal to him, or would just listen to him, to keep as much of the Alliance military out of the conflict as possible. On June 2nd of 2315, after months of warfare with no end in sight, James McKenna decided enough was enough and brought the TAS Dreadnought into Terra's orbit. He then destroyed 2 uninhabited islands to get everyone's attention and put a temporary stop to the fighting. It worked, and in a planet-wide broadcast, James addressed the whole of Earth, taking responsibility for the destruction of the islands and renounced both sides of the conflict, as well as the Alliance itself. He claimed that the Alliance had gotten stagnant and corrupt, and that if Earth was to take its rightful place in the galaxy and usher in a true golden age of human civilization, then a new regime was needed, under new leadership. McKenna then officially declared himself Director General of Terra, and demanded an immediate end to all hostilities, warning that if anyone were to oppose him, he would bomb them. The news received mixed receptions, and many political factions resisted, determined to fight to the last. So he bombed them. The survivors of the orbital strikes fled into cities, where they were quickly captured by Marines loyal to James and were either executed or arrested. After cleaning up all opposition and insurgents of Terra, James would then proceed to dissolve the Alliance, and in its place create the Terran Hegemony. There were both small and major changes, but the big one was that unlike the Alliance, the Hegemony would be led by a Director General and Lord Protector elected by the people and would hold the position for life. After the passing of the current Director General, a new Director General would supposedly be voted in, but we'll get to that later. The government was also streamlined, and the bureaucracy and corruption that plagued the Alliance was for now more or less eliminated, allowing the Hegemony to act far more quickly and efficiently than the Alliance could ever dream of. Democracy would end in silent applause, as the people of Terra, realizing that politicians couldn't do their jobs, were optimistic for a fresh change of government. By the end of the Alliance, they didn't have much say as to what would happen anyway, so at worst, this could be the chance to get someone competent in charge. To the surprise of no one, James would be elected as the first Director General in 2316, and he would be quick to show the effectiveness of the Hegemony. First, he abandoned all former Alliance worlds to his cause, which was a mostly peaceful affair, and he implemented reconstruction programs to clean up and rebuild Terra after the events of the Civil War. After that, he set a new goal for Terra, one he had likely been dreaming about ever since he became a naval officer: the reunification of mankind. The Hegemony would venture out into space and annex all human colonies to its cause, creating a new civilization dedicated to the scientific progress and prosperity for all mankind. Under James, of course. A truly selfless goal. Driven by this vision for nearly the rest of his life, McKenna would lead what he called campaigns of persuasion to, persuade the colony worlds to join the Hegemony. Minor details would change from each campaign, or even each world, but the overall strategy was the same. If you didn't resist, you got to join the Hegemony. If you did resist, you get bombed and still join the Hegemony. This was found to be very persuasive. The first campaign of persuasion started in the same year McKenna was elected, in March of 2316. Many would resist, but often the colonial forces were no match for the Hegemony's well-trained and equipped military. Even the ones that could put up a fight had no way to deal with the Hegemony's fleet of warships. This allowed the Hegemony to quickly expand, with low resistance, taking 40 new worlds by the end of the campaign in 2317. Emboldened by their success, James launched a second major campaign in 2320, which again saw many worlds try to resist, but the results were largely the same. Emboldened by their success, James launched a second major campaign in 2320, which again saw many worlds try to resist, but the results were largely the same, and many systems soon fell to the Hegemony. However, for those of you who are paying attention, you're still in the period of the Second Exodus, and by this point, many of the 5 great states had started to form. First, with the Free Worlds League founded by House Marquis in 2271. Then the Federated Suns, founded by House Davin in 2317. Followed by the Draconis Combine in 2319 by House Kurta. Then the Lyrian Commonwealth by House Steiner in 2340. And then finally the Compelling Confederation by House Lau in 2366. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize them just yet, and for now, we'll call them the 5 Great States. That's not the name they go by today, but it's a name we'll refer to them for now. Some, like the Federated Suns, would form in a direct response to the formation of the Hegemony. Others, like the Confederation, would form in a direct response to the nation seeking to protect them from the hegemony. Regardless as to how they were created, these nations posed a problem for the hegemony. Not only did these nations have large sums of manpower and the resources to build up their own forces, they were just also pretty big and far away from Terra. This posed a problem for the overstretched and undersupplied hegemony forces. The military was also still underdeveloped, as, while the hegemony did still have the technological advantage for now, there was a serious lack of development and equipment in certain areas, like the lack of a proper aerospace fighter. These gaps needed to be filled before the hegemony was ready to face dedicated resistance. Bearing in mind all these factors, McKenna became convinced he couldn't take control of all human worlds through simply bombing them into submission. So, he would put his campaigns on hold for a time, and change the hegemony's goal from one of war and conquest to one of peace and negotiation. He now tried to spread the message of peace, both within the hegemony and to the rest of human-controlled space. McKenna thought that if he played his cards right, he might be able to convince the larger nations to rejoin with Terra through more diplomatic means. Even if that failed, it would give him enough time to prepare his forces for a full invasion, so there aren't really any downsides. While McKenna did work to change the hegemony's image, he thought he could at least take some more of the border worlds around the hegemony's territory. This would lead him to launch his third major campaign in 2335 to bring them under his control. And then he failed. Badly. The campaign would be the hegemony's first big military defeat, and even worse, a large factor in his defeat would be his own son, due to his arrogance, short-sighted thinking, a desperate need to prove himself, and general incompetence. The campaign would end in 2338, and the hegemony's defeat would spark new tensions within, both from supporters of the old alliance and general critics of the hegemony and its rapid expansionism. Unwilling to demote his son, but loyal to the principles of his own nation, McKenna would abdicate his position in the same year the campaign ended, explaining in the public broadcast his personal conflict and duties, both to his nation and as a father. This would return the people's trust, and though his son was stripped of his rank, McKenna would ensure that his family would continue to serve as leaders of the hegemony for the remainder of his existence. Though McKenna would never know this fact, as 10 days after the broadcast, he would die of cancer. Ending the story of a man who once believed to be nothing but a lumberjack to becoming one of the most influential figures in history. So, what was the next step, you may ask, for the hegemony, and what happened to the rest of the galaxy? Well, that'll be answered right now, in part 2.